All right, so we are live. We are about to break down UFC 294, and I'm talking about the entire 13 card fight that we have lined up in front of you right here. So, what are some interesting things about this fight? Well, for one, you have Islam Makhachev taking on Volkanovski for the second time in 1 year. A champion versus champion fight in the same year, based on these circumstances of the fact that, well, you got Charles Oliveira not being able to make it because of an injury. And then on top of that, you got a co-main event in Kamaru Usman stepping in for none other than Paulo Costa, right? Because Paulo Costa sort of hinted this going into the fight, saying that, well, I had sort of an injury and whatnot. And because of that, well, he just decided to pull out. And then here comes Usman. And then there were also talks of a lot of people out there, including Chael Sonnen, saying that they would have rather seen, let's say, Bo Nickel step in. And if you guys want to take a look at the video that Chael Sonnen did on that, I suggest you guys take a look at it. It's quite interesting because he lays out situations where, let's say, if he was to lose, right, Kamaru Usman, or I'm sorry, Khamzat Shamayev, it would make this fight a whole lot more difficult to make later down the road because Bo Nickel's unranked. Khamzat Shamayev is 2 fights away from being a champion. And for them to work Bo Nickel all the way up to get that fight, well, he would have to go through a whole bunch of names on top of the fact that he's just being skipped over from a whole bunch of different people that are already highly ranked in him, and interesting matchups that are to be made. And then Izzy is in the mix because of the fact that, well, he wanted to take some time off after the Sean Strickland loss, right? From 2019 and on, he's had like about 11 title fights, defended all of them, and some he didn't, some he lost, and then some he came back and won again. Nonetheless, great matchup. 2 guys are literally moving up to the 185 division. So let's start off from the beginning. Let's take a look at all the different cards, all the different fights that are in this card, right? You got Ankalaev taking on Johnny Walker. You got Ikram, a guy who had lost to Khamzat Shamayev in Brave FC, now coming into the UFC taking on Warley Alves, a guy who has a win over Colby Covington. And then you have Saeed Nurmagomedov taking on Gafarov. Then you have Makhachev taking on Tim Elliott. And you have Trevor Peak taking on Muhammad Yahya, who is a local Emirati fighter. Then you got Victor Henry taking on Bashat. You have Abu Azatar taking on Dumas. Here you have the UFC debut of Anshul Jabali taking on Mike Breeden. And then you have Nathaniel Wood taken on, what is this guy's name right here? Let's take a look right here. Who is this guy fighting? Let's see here. Saeed Nurmagomedov, Ikram, and in the prelims, Nathaniel Wood and Muhammad Naimov. And then you have Victoria Dukova taking on Jin Frey. So let me give you guys some, what do you call it? Oh, and how about this? The debut of Sharaputin Magomedov taking on Bruno Silva, right? So I'm going to give you guys a breakdown of this whole entire card and give you a little bit of some storylines leading up to this fight, which I think is really interesting. For one, let's start off with Sharaputin Magomedov. Now, what can I say about this guy? The guy is from Dagestan, got into a fight with some random dude at the mall for showing a public display of affection, which, by the way, as you know, is a big no-no in the Islamic world, right? So he went up and punched that guy, and then the video went viral, and this is before he made his UFC debut, which is going to be this weekend. Now, you have Bruno Silva going into this fight. It's almost like he's cannon fodder for this fight. He's got 9 losses of different ways that he's lost before. And let's take a look at some of the losses that, let's say, Bruno Silva has had to try to understand his matchup, right? So in his last fight, he had against Brendan Allen, which wasn't too long ago during the summer of June 24th, 2023. Brendan Allen gets a submission rear naked choke against Brendan Allen. And then before that, he beat Brad Tavares, but then he lost to Gerald Meerschaert by submission, which is no shame considering Gerald Meerschaert has had the most submissions in middleweight history. Alex Pereira was another guy that he has fought on Alex Pereira's way up to win the 185 title, and that series he had with Izzy. He had a win over Jordan Wright, the Beverly Hills Ninja, Andrew Sanchez, longtime UFC vet. He's been on a winning streak from, let's say, 2017 all the way up to 2022, in which he had 2 losses in a row from Alex Pereira and Gerald Meerschaert. So he actually went to a decision with Alex Pereira, which is quite interesting because Alex Pereira was just knocking people out on his way up, including the current middleweight champion of the world right now. So how do I see this fight going on with Magomedsharipov, the Bullet? I can see this fight really going either way, right? He's very well-rounded, sambo player, has good kicks, good submissions, good wrestling like most Dagestanis. This is literally his fight to win. So I got Sharipov Magomedov in this fight versus Silva. And then you got Jinyu Frey. Oh, wait a minute. Who is this one right here? This is not Jinyu Frey. Yeah, this is Jinyu Frey. I'm sorry. Taken on Victoria Dukakova. Undefeated, 7-0. Once again, this is one of those fights where it is Victoria Dudakova to win. She's one of those prospects that the UFC wants to promote, wants to put out there and commercialize and advertise as one of the up-and-coming people in the women's strawweight division. Now, Jinyu Frey is a great challenge for this particular matchup, considering the fact that Jinyu Frey has had a lot of, let's say, close decisions throughout her career. So it's going to be a good matchup for Victoria and a good test. I would say maybe this goes to a decision with the favor going into Victoria. Same thing with the fight with Sharipov Magomedov. I could see him winning this fight in either way, but I could also see him getting, let's say, a 3rd round stoppage. Now, why is that? Well, because this is a UFC, right? There's a debut. And of course, a lot of people always mention something to the effect of debut UFC jitters. Some say that it's real, some say it's not. I have a feeling that it's going to be 50-50 for him, meaning that he is going to feel it in some kind of way. At the same time, he's also in a situation where, let's say, during the fight, he's going to start feeling the pressure of being in the bright lights, being in Abu Dhabi for the first time, fighting in the UFC in front of a Muslim audience that is pro-Dagestani and pro-Muslim fighters are going to be in this card, which brings a lot of pressure into him. So he's going to try to adjust all throughout the 1st and 2nd round, and maybe in the 3rd round, he's going to start catching his groove and maybe start catching Silva in the later rounds, which he will probably take him down and perhaps get a submission or some sort, if not a knockout. Again, this is his fight to win. It can go either way. It's MMA, but I'm going with the Bullet for this one. Next fight, you got Nathaniel Wood taking on Muhammad Naimov. Now, let's take a look at Muhammad Naimov, right? 9-2 at the current moment of time. Let's take a look at his record. Okay, so let's see. Let's take a look at Topology for a second here. Muhammad the Hillman Naimov, right? Fighting out of Tajikistan. So this brother right here has had a win over Jamie Malarkey. Mind you, Jamie Malarkey is a top 155er. Prior to that, he fought in Tough Enough. And by the way, that's not a very bad win for your UFC debut, right? Jamie Malarkey, out of all people. And then you got Nathaniel Wood in the mix of this situation, right? What can we say about Nathaniel Wood? Well, for one, right now, Nathaniel Wood is 20-5, 20 wins, 5 losses. Okay, he is a featherweight, a true featherweight at that, fighting out of London, England. And he's had a win over Andre Fili by a decision, a win over Charles Jourdain, Charles Rosa. These are all very good names, but he's had a decision loss against Casey Kenny, which kind of shows you just the competitive texture of the UFC and what this particular league can offer you with the different names that are going to be hard to compete with, right? I mean, you have Andre Fili, who's a longtime vet in the UFC, Charles Jourdain, and then Charles Rosa, just all by decisions, right? Just didn't really get the type of knockouts and finishes that he should have gotten in the UFC, right? He has a loss over John Dodson. He's got a win over Jose Alberto Canez. So, how I see this fight, I could honestly see Magomedsharipov winning this for the fact that Nathaniel Wood is a bantamweight going into a featherweight, and Magomedsharipov beat a top 155er, right? Obviously, maybe not a top 15 155er, or maybe somewhere in that line of top 15, top 20. But just within outside of that, he's world level, and he beat a world level guy in Jamie Malarkey. I'm going to go with Muhammad by decision on this one. Moving on with the card, you have, let's see here, you have Anush Jabali fighting out of India. Now, the interesting thing about this is he's a 7-0 guy taking on Mike Breeden. What's interesting about Mike Breeden, he seems to be this guy that they bring in to fight, let's say, debut guys if they want a sure win. Now, being that he's from India, you would imagine, right? This is a particular market that the UFC wants to exploit in some kind of way. And why wouldn't they? There's a billion people in India. He's an Indian fighter who's undefeated, taking on Mike Breeden. I just see this guy being able to do what he wants with him in this fight. Again, this is one of those fights where it is for him to win. But once again, it's MMA. You never know what's going to happen in that particular aspect of this fight, right? So I'm going to go with Jabali on this one. I'm sorry, I was going to call him something else. Jabali. That's how you pronounce his name. Sorry if I mispronounce his name, but this is his fight to win nonetheless. He's a former veteran at, I believe, Road to UFC, which is one of those contender type of fights, like Dana White's Contender Series type of fights, but the Asian version. And once again, I think that he's going to have the octagon jitters going in, but I think that he's going to feel out the process as he's going through the rounds, going through the motions, not really overfighting, not really doing anything that is just underneath, you know, what he is trying to do. Like, he's not going to overcommit. He's not going to go in there and try to brawl or anything like that. He's going to fight very technical and very methodical and try to give a good account of himself as this fight goes on. And again, Mike Breeden is just a guy that they bring in to get beat up by everybody, especially with a top prospect like this in a region where the UFC can exploit at some point, right? So moving on with the card, what do we have here? That is the early prelims that I had just covered right now. Now moving on into the preliminary cards, which is the one after the early prelims. We're going to start off with Abu Azatar taking on Cedric Dumas. Now, I've seen Cedric Dumas fight in the Jacksonville card just recently. Now, the interesting thing about this particular fight is that I'm kind of a little bit nervous for Abu Azatar in this fight, because a couple of things to notice about this guy outside of the cage, right? He's what you would call somewhat of one of these European Arab hooligan gangsters, right? And then on top of that, he's friends with the king of Morocco because he's one of the few guys from Morocco to make it to the UFC. So, of course, he's going to have that type of clout with, let's say, politicians or royals and leaders of his country, and they want to get close to him. And he has a very close relationship with the king. And I urge you guys to take a look at some online stuff about his relationship with the king and some of the things that he does outside of UFC, I almost feel like he's using his fight career to, let's say, perhaps maybe hide some other nefarious things that he has going on outside of the octagon. But that's neither here or there. What I'm trying to say is that Dumas seems to be the guy that is a lot more focused on being a mixed martial artist. I remember his fight in Jacksonville. They mentioned something to the effect where he had to travel, let's say, about 7 hours or something like that, driving up and down Florida just to get some training sessions in. So you got to understand, this is a very highly motivated guy, and a guy that does nothing but train all day, doesn't have any friends with royal families around the world, doesn't have any gang affiliations, at least not to any of our knowledge, right? But nonetheless, this is, I really am afraid for this fight for Abu Azatar, right? I'm almost very hesitant on picking him, but if I'm going to pick him, it's going to be based on just biasness. But if I want to look at this objectively, this is Dumas's fight to win in one way or another. Now, could he finish him off? There's a great possibility of that, depending on just how shortcoming of a training camp Abu Azatar got into this fight. But I could also see him winning a decision on this one. So moving on with the card, we have Bashat taking on Victor Henry. Now, here's an interesting thing about Bashat, right? He was the guy that fought an Israeli fighter during the Dana White's Contender Series. And what's really fascinating about that fight was, now that you have this situation going on with Palestine and Israel, it's kind of interesting to bring this up because the Israeli fighter called him a terrorist going into this fight. And then after that, he beat the brakes off him and got himself a contract with the UFC because of that. Now he's taking on Victor Henry, who has world experience. And by the way, this is the reason why I'm sort of giving you guys different pictures of these fighters from the regional scenes that they fought at. Because oftentimes, when we look at a fighter that's fighting into the UFC, we only look at what they have going on in the UFC, right? What they did in the UFC. It's like as if nothing else mattered in their whole entire career. Now, he's 36 years old at 135 pounds. Not exactly the most ideal age in this particular weight class, but he does have a win over Tony Gravely, which was all the way back in March, right? He has a loss over Rafael Assunção by a decision, and then has beat the likes of Raoni Barcelos back in 2022. I really see this win for Bashat only because of the fact that he's undefeated, 14-0. He's got momentum on his side. There's just some things that you can't teach when it comes to guys that are undefeated. Sometimes being undefeated is a momentum that just keeps you going. And you know what? If you want to place your, well, I don't advocate gambling in any way. And by the way, I don't do prediction shows for the sake of gambling, but just to kind of break down the fights and to show you how these things are going to go. I just think that the momentum is going to be on his side. I got Bashat on this one and this particular fight. Now, moving on in the card, we got Muhammad Yahya taking on Trevor Peek. Here's another guy that's undefeated, right? Now, once again, I have to be very careful about how I pick this because, look, let's just be honest, right? We do have our own biasness when it comes to certain guys. But once again, Trevor Peek is 8-0, doesn't have any losses. And then Muhammad Yahya, coming off the regional scene, is 12-3. Now, let's take a look at his record coming into this fight. By the way, he's one of the few and only local fighters in this particular card because he's the only Emirati fighter, right? He had a loss against Dan Collins in the UAE Warriors card back in 2020 by a Darce choke. He's also been choked out by Gavin Hughes and has been knocked out by Hassan Talal and Desert Force back in 2016. But he is coming off of a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 winning streak and is going into his UFC debut against Trevor Peek. Now, this is going to be a very difficult matchup for him So, unfortunately, I'm going to have to go with Trevor Peek on this one in terms of a decision. He's had a few finishes in the regional scene on arm triangle choke and in a TKO against Yazid back in, when was that? 2021. So I see Trevor Peek once again riding off the momentum of being undefeated and getting the nod on this one right here. So as we move on to the card, what do we have here? We have Muhammad Makhachev taking on Tim Elliott. Now, here's a thing that I want to share with you guys, right? I mentioned that Tim Elliott is going into this fight with a heavy baggage. Now, look at the picture right here. That's a picture of him and his significant other with Seinfeld on top saying that's a shame, because if you guys know, and if you guys are hardcore fans and follow the sport, you know exactly what happened to Tim Elliott. I don't even want to repeat it, but let's just say that Muhammad Makhachev is going into this fight with all his ducks in a row. I've mentioned the fact that he's trained with the likes of the head of the special forces of the Bahraini government, which is a crown prince out of all people, right? And gave him all these different facilities to work at and train at and just have all the best advantages. So if you guys want to check out a video that I did on this particular subject, I called it the psychology breakdown of Muhammad Makhachev versus Tim Elliott. It is on the live streaming portion section of my channel if you guys want to check it out. So yeah, come check it out if you guys want to take a look at some more psychological breakdowns of this fight, the history of these two guys. But once again, I see this momentum going in to the favor of Muhammad Makhachev. He starts off very fast. Tim Elliott is going to give him a good fight because Tim Elliott has good footwork. He's got great wrestling, offense and defense, but I just think Muhammad Makhachev is going to be a little bit better, and he's got improved striking going on. But I think this is going to be a great matchup for Muhammad Makhachev as he moves up in the division, taking on the likes of Manil Cap, maybe even the likes of Brendan Moreno and the other top names in this division. Tim Elliott has been a former challenger of the title against Demetrius Johnson in the past. So once again, this will be a great test for Muhammad Makhachev. And on top of that, you got to also take into consideration Tim Elliott is a little bit old, and that's not going to be very helpful going into a 125 fight out of all things, right, in a flyweight division. Now, we move on to the main card of this fight. We have on the main card right here, we have Saeed Nurmagomedov taking on Muin Gafarov. This is an absolute mismatch, right? Just based on the fact that, well, Saeed Nurmagomedov is a little bit longer, even though he's 1 inch taller, right? Has better striking, really great at his takedown defense. And then if you try to shoot on him, he may just try to catch you with, let's say, a guillotine choke of some sort. I see Saeed Nurmagomedov getting a rear naked choke in this fight, just based on the mismatch that we have going on here. Now, moving on, we have the guy who was known to be knocked out by Khamzat Shamayev, Ikram Ali Askarov, taking on Warley Alves. Now, what can we say about Warley Alves? A veteran, 32 years old, from Brazil, 170 former 170-pound fighter, moving up, has a loss over Nicholas Dalby, has been knocked out by Jeremy Wells, has a win over Munir Lazez, and has a rear naked choke loss against Randy Brown. This is a fight where, let's just say that this is Ikram's fight to win. He's getting injuries, getting a little bit older, getting damaged, and Ikram has really only taken damage by none other than Khamzat with that devastating knockout. But Warley Alves has a win over Colby Covington, but we're talking about way back in 2015, and now we're talking about a way much more evolved Colby Covington. So I see this one as a win for Ikram over Alves, probably by a second round stoppage. That's how I see this fight. Now, moving on, we have Ankalaev taking on Johnny Walker. So the interesting thing about this fight, what you're going to see out of this fight is a very technical matchup from Ankalaev. He's going to try to make it very stale, but also very methodical and not try to rush in. Whereas I could see Johnny Walker being the guy that will rush in, will use his speed and his explosiveness to try to win this fight. But I also see that if, let's say, Ankalaev is not able to make this into a technical striking matchup, and let's say if Johnny Walker gets the better of him on the feet, I could see Ankalaev shooting for a takedown once he gets in trouble. That's always something that's in his back pocket. This guy loves to strike. You've seen that in the Jan Blachowicz fight and made it very close. But at the same time, if he needs to, he will go and try and take you down. I see this fight by a decision based on the fact that Ankalaev is going to control the pace of this matchup. He's going to control the range, and he's going to try to nullify the speed and the explosiveness of Johnny Walker and basically get away from it or use it against him to some degree. So Ankalaev by decision on this one. Now, moving on to the co-main event of the night. We have Kamaru Usman taking on Khamzat Shamayev. So here's the thing that you got to understand. Kamaru Usman has never moved up in the middleweight division. He had a chance when he was the 170 champion, the welterweight champion, but has never really taken that next step into the 185 division, primarily because Izzy was the champion at the time. So because of that, I think that he is now taking that challenge based on the fact that he's done everything that he needed to do at the 170 division. But you also got to take into consideration he's beaten a lot of guys that are former 155ers. The size difference that he's going to have to deal with Khamzat in this is going to be fairly significant. On top of that, you also got to take into consideration Khamzat Shamayev is on a hot streak. And, well, one can argue that Kamaru Usman is on his way down. He's had knee problems. He's had some injuries in his hands. And now he's going into this fight. He's been knocked out by Leon Edwards. I could see Khamzat Shamayev really starting fast in this fight. Fast on the feet and fast when he tries to shoot for a double leg takedown or tries to have grappling exchanges with this guy. So this is something you got to really look out for. Another thing you got to look out for in this particular matter at hand is that how will Usman deal with the rush of Khamzat when he comes and charges in? Is he going to be able to deal with that? Is he going to be able to have the speed and the recovery from all these injuries that he's had in order to keep up with the insane level of pace that Khamzat puts up? If you notice, Khamzat, when he fought Kevin Holland in his last fight, man, he just went in there with reckless abandonment, had no respect for Kevin Holland's grappling to any degree. He just knew that as soon as he was going to get him on the ground, that he was going to submit him, and he did. So I could definitely see the same thing going down with Kamaru Usman in this particular fight. Why? Well, because for one, you got to understand, right? This is a fight where Usman is coming off of losses, coming off of injuries, coming off of the fact that he's going into a new weight class that he's never competed before. Whereas with Khamzat, he's fought in these weight classes, and irregardless of the fact that they're saying, oh, Khamzat is going to get a title shot when he never really beat the top guys of this division because, yes, former champion in Usman, correct, but never really fought at 185. And that was kind of the argument of this whole thing because him beating, let's say, Paulo Costa would have solidified that him in the 185 division. Whereas with this fight, this is one of those situations where we could have seen this at the 170 mark when Usman was champion, but here we are. Now we're in these circumstances of him going in 11 days notice, all these injuries, the fact that Khamzat has been fully primed and ready for months, maybe even almost a year going into this. And I just think that this is going to favor Kamaru Usman. Now, moving on to the card, in the main event of the night, I really see that same situation going on with Islam Makhachev versus Volk. Now, a lot of people are going to be expecting that this is going to be the same Volkanovski that you saw in February back in Perth. Now, interestingly enough, I like that when Ariel Helwani pressed him on these accusations of Islam cheating, he sort of put that in the back pocket. He said, nah, I'm not going to touch this subject. This is going to be about me fighting this guy and nothing else and nothing more, nothing less. He's going into this fight very, very clear-headed, non-emotional, matter of fact, stoic. However, unfortunately, that's not going to be enough. Volk was originally set to fight Elliott for the 145 pounds undisputed championship in January. But because of this short notice, he decided to come in, and perhaps maybe they're going to scratch that fight out. And who knows what's going to happen with that if, let's say, Islam really hurts him badly. You also got to take into consideration the fact that Volkanovski has been cutting weight for this fight. So he's going to come into this a whole lot smaller, maybe a whole lot more drained. Whereas with Islam Makhachev has just been doing what he naturally does, trying to go down to the 145 division. I'm sorry, the 155 division, right? He walks around at 180, 30 pounds down. He's been in camp for months on out now. So has Volkanovski, but was preparing for a different fight, Volkanovski. He was preparing for 145 fight. I honestly could see Islam finishing him this time by either TKO or submission in the later rounds before the championship round. So somewhere in the second or third round, he's going to finish off Volkanovski. So that right there is the entire fight card of UFC 294 and the storylines that are involved in this particular fight. So I hope you guys enjoyed this content. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And I will see you guys at the fights and in the post-fight breakdowns. And maybe even more videos to come during the week as the fight week goes on. So, inshallah, like and subscribe. Enjoy.